Government of India Act of 1919, Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms of 1919.
Factors leading to the Act.
Disillusionment with 1909 Act intensified political tensions in India, prompting passage of laws like Indian Press Act 1910, Seditious Meeting Act 1911, Criminal Law Act 1913, and Defence of India Act 1915. The Congress League Pact of 1916 arose due to British hostility towards Turkey and disagreements over the establishment of the Muslim University at Aligarh. The outbreak of the First World War occurred. Various constitutional reform schemes emerged, including Gokhale's scheme, the Round Table scheme, and the joint scheme of Congress and Muslim League. Wartime politics in India unfolded, with British difficulties seen as India's opportunity, leading to the Home Rule movement and the Ghadar movement. These prompted shift in government's attitude, culminating in the Montagu Declaration on 20 August 1917. Facts. The Act marked the end of benevolent despotism and introduction of responsible government in India. Secretary of State for India, Edwin Montagu. Viceroy of India, Lord Chelmsford, Frederick John Napier Thesiger.
Provisions or features of the Act.
The Act began with a preamble based on Montagu Declaration of 20 August 1917. It highlighted that India is the integral part of the British Empire. British Parliament to determine the timing and approach to achieving responsible government. Changes in home government. Established Office of High Commissioner for India in London, who acts as an agent of Viceroy. Secretary of State for India's was now to be paid by British Exchequer, ending home charges and rectifying the injustice of the Charter Act of 1793. Some functions were transferred to the High Commissioner. Changes in central government. Executive. Governor-General Viceroy acts as a chief executive authority. Viceroy's Executive Council had 8 members, including 3 Indians, excluding the Commander-in-Chief, allotted portfolios like law, education, labor health, or industry. Indian members in the council was increased from 2 to 3. Legislature. Introduced bicameralism or bicameral legislature in the central legislature. Lower House. Indian Legislative Assembly had 145 members, for 3-year terms. 41 nominated, 26 officials, 15 non-official. 104 elected, 52 general, 30 Muslims, 2 Sikhs, 20 special. It introduced method of direct election for the first time. Upper House, Council of States, had 60 members for 5-year terms containing only male members. Out of 60, 26 nominated and 34 elected, 20 general, 10 Muslims, 3 Europeans, 1 Sikh. Women were not allowed to become a member and franchise was highly restricted. System of communal electorate continued and was extended to Sikhs, Europeans, Christians, and Anglo-Indians. Right to ask supplementary question was introduced to all members of the legislature. Act 1991 has asking original questions can only ask supplementary question. Proposed gradual decentralization with a loosening of central government control, i.e. aiming for a decentralized but firm unitary system. Provided partial responsibility to Indians in provinces, while maintaining the central government's character unchanged. Accordingly has two administration lists, central and provincial list. Provinces handled the provincial list, while the centre managed the central list. Governor-General Viceroy. Governor-General's assent needed for a bill to become law, even if both houses passed it. Authority to enact a bill without legislative consent. Ability to issue ordinances, certify rejected bills, and retain power to summon and dissolve the House. Power to prevent a bill from becoming law for the sake of peace. He has discretion to disallow questions, adjournment motions, or debates in the House. Devolution of powers refers to the transfer or delegation of authority, responsibilities, and decision-making powers from a higher or central authority to lower or local levels of government. Changes in provisional government. Provisional autonomy. Introduction of provincial autonomy aimed at implementing decentralization and devolution of powers, with independent power defined in the devolution rules. Devolution was implemented in finance, legislation, and administration. Legislative devolution achieved by categorizing legislation into central, provincial, and residuary lists, addressing subjects of national, provincial, and reserved importance, respectively. Financial devolution. Separation of central and provincial budgets for the first time, authorizing provincial legislatures to create their budgets. Complete separation of revenue sources between the centre and provinces. Legislative devolution. Legislation separated into two lists, central and provincial. Central list includes national or multi-province subjects like foreign affairs, defense, communications, post and telegraphs, patents, currency, tariff and customs, political relations, etc. Provincial list covers subjects relevant only to provinces like local self-government, public health, sanitation, education, agriculture, land revenue, forest, water supply, law and order, etc. Residual subjects vested in Governor-General in Council. Provincial government empowered to make laws for peace and good governance. Central control maintained by sending acts to GG for potential assent, then to the Secretary of State. Provisional executive. Diarchy was introduced in the provinces. Introduction of diarchy with two classes of administrators, executive councillors and ministers. Subjects categorized into reserved and transferred lists. Transferred list. The governor, with ministers, managed the transferred list, appointing, nominated, ministers from elected council members and holding them accountable, responsible, to the legislature. Transferred subjects included education, local self-government, health, agriculture, excise, industry, public works, religious endowments, etc. Reserved list. The governor, along with executive councillors, managed the reserved list, who were appointed by the Crown for 5 years, were jointly responsible to the Viceroy and Secretary of State for India and not accountable to the legislature. Reserved subjects included law and order, irrigation, electricity, mines, factories, finance, land revenue, police, justice, etc. Provisional legislature. Each province has unicameral legislature. Increased size of provincial legislative assemblies, with around 70% elected members. Introduction of communal and class electorates. Direct elections with restricted franchise, partial women's suffrage but not allowed to contest elections. Legislators granted freedom of speech. Governor's assent required for bill passage, veto power and ordinance issuance vested on him. Legislative councils could reject the budget, but the governor had the authority to reinstate it. Note: Instrument of Instructions contained governs relation between provincial governor and ministers. Other changes. Establishment of the first Public Service Commission in India, recommending simultaneous exams in India and England, and 1/3rd local recruitment annually. Central Public Service Commission created in 1926 for civil servant recruitment. Local self-government transferred under popular ministerial control. Provinces allowed to develop local self-governing institutions. Finance remained a reserved subject, limiting Indian ministers' role in local self-government due to lack of funds. Provision for an established of statutory commission after 10 years. This led to the formation of Simon Commission in 1927. Merits of the 1919 Act. Signalled the end of benevolent despotism, initiating the evolution toward responsible government in India. Diakey introduced the concept of responsible government. Introduced a federal structure with a unitary bias. Increased Indian participation in administration, holding portfolios like labor and health. First-time elections fostered political consciousness, granting some Indian women the right to vote. Limitations of the Act. Extended and consolidated communal representation. Limited franchise to those with specific property, taxable income, and high land revenue. Governors-General and governors held considerable power to undermine legislatures at the centre and provinces. Seat allocation in the central legislature was not based on population but on the perceived importance of the province to the British. INC's objections to Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. No specific time frame provided for the reforms. The government solely determined the nature and timing of progress towards responsible government. Resentment among Indians as the British decided what was deemed good or bad for them. Government of India Act of 1935.
Factors leading to the Act.
The deficiencies of the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, 1919, prompted a demand for additional constitutional reforms, culminating in the GOI Act of 1935. 1920 to 27 reform proposals, Motilal Nehru calls for framing Indian Constitution by Constituent Assembly in 1924. The All-British Simon Commission, 1927, reviewing GOI Act of 1919 faced Indian opposition for lack of Indian representation, fueling demands for inclusivity. Lahore session of Congress in December 1929, adopted Purna Swaraj, or complete independence as its goal. Civil disobedience movement, 1930 to 1934, led by Mahatma Gandhi, highlighted the necessity for political reforms to address Indian aspirations and grievances by challenging British authority through non-violent resistance. Roundtable Conferences, 1930 to 1932, in London, although unsuccessful in reaching a consensus, contributed to the discourse on the future constitutional structure of India. The 1933 White Paper outlined British proposals for Indian constitutional reforms and served as the basis for the eventual GOI Act of 1935.
Provisions or features of the Act.
Sources of the Act. Government of India Act of 1935 was passed on the basis of Report of the Simon Commission, Report of All Parties Conference or Nehru Report, Outcome of the Roundtable Conferences, White Paper issued by the British government in 1933. Main provisions. Abolition of Indian Council of the Secretary of State. Establishment of All India Federation at the centre, consisting of provinces of British India and the princely states. Federation did not come into existence as the princely states refused to give their consent for union. Bicameral central legislatures. It consists of His Majesty represented by GG and two houses, Council of State and Federal Assembly. Consists of representatives of British India directly elected people and of Indian states nominated by rulers. Division of powers. The Act divided legislative powers into three lists: Federal List, Provincial List, and Concurrent List, specifying subjects over which the federal and provincial legislatures had jurisdiction. Introduced diarchy at the centre where the Governor-General and his councillors administered the reserved subjects, while Council of Ministers were responsible for the transferred subjects. Diarchy at the provinces was abolished. Governor-General held discretionary powers over defence, external affairs, ecclesiastical, religious affairs, and excluded and partially excluded areas, tribal areas. Extension of separate electorates was extended to various communities, including women in general and Sikhs, Muslim and Christian women, commerce and industry, landlords, labor, university, backward areas and tribes, etc. The Act established Federal Court at Delhi with a Chief Justice and 6 judges to adjudicate on federal matters. The Act established Federal Public Service Commission and Joint Public Service Commission. Establishment of Reserve Bank of India, RBI, in 1935, as recommended by the Hiltonian Commission. Introduction of direct elections significantly increasing the franchise from 7 million to 35 million people. Introduction of provincial autonomy, Act recognized provinces as separate legal entity where provinces derived their power and authority directly from the British Crown. Provincial legislatures of Bengal, Madras, Bombay, United Provinces, Bihar, and Assam were made bicameral. Creation of new provinces and Burma's separation from India. Governor granted discretionary powers in summoning House, appointing ministers, and assenting to bills. Criticism of the 1935 Act. No introduction of dominion status by the Act or future concessions. Lack of clarity on the transition period from responsible government to complete independence. Diarchy at the center implied full responsibility, yet the introduction of responsible government at the center did not occur. Representatives of states in the federal legislature directly appointed by princes and given unduly large representation. Limited franchise tied to property qualification, granting voting rights to only 14% of the total population. Extension of the divisive system of communal representation. Retention of control over various All India services by the Secretary of State. The governor's special powers ensured concentration of both political and economic control in British hands. Reactions to the 1935 Act. Congress criticized and rejected the Act, demanding the convening of a constituent assembly elected through adult franchise to draft a constitution for an independent India. Nehru described it as a machine with strong brakes but no engine, and referred to it as a charter of slavery. Jinnah criticized it as thoroughly rotten, fundamentally bad, and totally unacceptable.